I discovered that everything I wrote came true in real life. I write horror stories for a living, and last month I wrote one about a man who finds a dead bird on his porch, and the next morning there was a dead bird on mine. I did not think much of it at first. Birds die. I sat down to write and forgot about it. But that night I wrote a small scene where a stranger leaves a single yellow flower on a man's step, and the next morning there was one on mine, the exact kind I had described. That one I could not laugh off. So I did a test. I wrote one plain sentence in my notebook, that the lights in my apartment would go out at 9 o'clock that night and come back on a minute later. At 9, the lights went out. They came back a minute later. I sat in the dark in between and understood that something was very wrong. I tried to stop. For 2 days I wrote nothing at all, because I was afraid of what a single careless line might do. But not writing did not undo what I had already written. That was the part I had not understood yet. My editor Owen called the next morning about my deadline. I told him what was happening. He laughed and said I had been writing scary stories too long and they were getting into my head. I asked him to come over, and while he was still on the phone, I wrote that he would knock 3 times and then drop his keys on the floor. When he arrived, he knocked 3 times. He came in, reached into his pocket, and his keys fell out of his hand. He stood there looking at them. He was not laughing anymore. That was when I remembered the other story. 3 weeks before any of this started, before I knew what my writing could do, I had finished a story and sent it off. In that story, a man hears knocking at his door at midnight. The first night, it is 1 knock. The second night, 2. It climbs like that, night after night. And on the 7th night, the man opens the door, and the thing that has been knocking comes inside, and the story ends there. I had already written it. And that night, at midnight, I heard 1 knock on my front door. I did not open it. I made myself look through the peephole, and the hallway was empty, but the knock had been real and heavy and close, and there was no one out there who could have made it. I sat still until morning. The next night came 2 knocks, slow and spaced apart, and then nothing. I called Owen and told him I had to leave before the 7th night. He told me to come stay at his place across town. I packed a bag and drove there, and at midnight the knocking came on Owen's door. 3 knocks. Even though it was not my apartment, Owen heard it. He went pale and did not say anything for a long time. Running was useless. I had written it about a man, and I was the man, and it would follow me wherever I went and keep its count. So I drove home and tried to write the knocking away. I wrote that it stopped and never came again. That night it came 4 times, and then again an hour later, 4 more, as if my writing had only made it hungrier. The thing did not care what I wanted. It only did exactly what the words said, and my words had been weak and vague. I had written that the knocking stopped, but not how, not what happened to the thing doing it, and so it had found a gap and slipped through. I learned the rule had no mercy and would punish every lazy word. I had 3 nights left. I read my old story again and saw the trap clearly. The story said the man opens the door on the 7th night. As long as that sentence stood, the door would open with my hand or without it. I could not unwrite what was already sent, but I could write what came next. The 5th night, the knocking came 5 times, hard enough to shake the door frame. I sat in the hallway outside my apartment with my back against the wall and counted each knock and did not sleep. The 6th night came 6, slower this time, spaced further apart, like something that was no longer in a hurry because it knew there was only 1 night left. On the 7th day, I wrote the most careful thing I had ever written. I wrote that on the 7th night, the man would open the door himself before the knock, on his own terms, and that there would be nothing on the other side, that whatever had been counting would find the doorway empty and have no man to take, because the man who wrote it would lay down his pen forever the moment the door swung open, and a story with no writer cannot finish, and a thing with no writer cannot be written into a house. At 1 minute to midnight, I put my hand on the lock. When the clock turned, I opened the door and stepped back. The hallway was empty. No knock came. But when I looked down, I saw something that stopped me cold. A single printed page from one of my published stories. The one about a woman who starts finding notes in her own handwriting that she never wrote, sitting just inside the gap. Someone had slid it under while I was waiting. I picked it up. 1 line was circled in red ink. She never finds out who is writing her life. Whoever left that page knew what I could do, and they were telling me my published stories were still happening to real people. I could not lay down my pen. Not yet. Not until I found out how many stories were still alive. I sat at my desk and pulled up every file, every submission, every published piece I had sent out over the past 2 years and counted them one by one. The number was 14. 14 horror stories, all out in the world with my name on them, and every single one of them ended badly for someone. That was the whole point. That was what horror was supposed to do. But now I was reading them like police reports. I searched for specific plot details, things precise enough that a normal news story would never match by accident. It took 4 hours. By the end, I had 3 hits, and each one made me feel sicker than the last. A woman on a forum who had been posting about finding notes around her apartment in handwriting that looked exactly like hers, notes she swore she had never written, saying things she had never thought, the details matching my story down to where they appeared, on the bathroom mirror, inside the drawers beside the sink, folded into her shoes. Then a local news piece about a man whose entire block had gone empty in one night, no moving trucks, no signs, just dark windows and silence, and I had written that street exactly. The third was a family who had called the fire department 11 times in 2 months because their house kept filling with the smell of heavy smoke, but every inspection came back clean, and the family in my story smells smoke every single day until the ending, and the ending was not kind. 3 confirmed out of 14. I left a note on my doorstep the next morning in plain block letters. I know what I did. Tell me who you are. The following day, the page on my floor had no circle, no red ink, just an address in careful handwriting, 20 minutes from my apartment. I grabbed my keys. The drive led me to a block of old apartment buildings with chipped paint and narrow hallways. I found the door and stood there with my fist raised, not sure what I was going to say. I knocked anyway. The woman who answered was maybe 30 and looked like she had not slept in weeks, the kind of tired that hollows you from the inside. She looked at me and said, "You're the one who writes the stories." She reached behind the door and held out a copy of my book, the collected edition from the previous fall. The cover was soft and worn from being handled too many times. Sticky notes poked from at least a dozen pages, crammed with small handwriting. She held it like evidence. "Because I'm living in one." Page 42. The woman who finds notes in her own handwriting. That's me. That's been me for 5 5 months. She stepped back and let me in. Her name was Kay. Her apartment was small and clean, but there was something wrong with the air, something heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. She set a shoebox on the table in front of me and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of notes, scraps of paper, napkins, pages from notebooks, receipts with handwriting on the back, all in the same script, her script. I could tell because there was a grocery list on the refrigerator behind her and the letters matched exactly. I started reading. Some were almost ordinary. One said, "You left the window open." Another said, "The milk is going bad," but they got worse. "You are not safe here. He is watching from the window." One said, "Stop looking at the door." Another said, "He already knows you are home." Every single note matched something from my story, not close to it. Exact. The same phrases, the same placement, the same slow build from harmless to threatening that I had written 9 months ago, thinking I was being clever with pacing. She watched me read them and said, "At first I thought I was losing my mind. 2 doctors told me I was writing the notes myself during some kind of dissociation, that I just needed rest. I almost believed them. Then my friend Renata found your book in a shop and read it to me out loud, and I heard my own life coming out of her mouth." She said it flat, like reporting a fact, but her hands were shaking. She reached into the shoebox and pulled out one note sitting apart from the rest. 5 words. "Tomorrow, you will not remember your own name." In my story, that was the second to last note. The one after it was blank because the woman was already gone. Kay was 1 note away from the ending I had written. I told her I would fix it. I promised her. She laughed, short and dry. "You already tried, didn't you?" she said. "I saw it. Last night the notes went blank for 10 seconds. Then they came back, and a new one appeared in the drawer beside my bed that said something worse. That was you, trying to write it away." I told her it was. She said, "Then you know you can't just erase it. You have to finish it, but you have to finish it right." I called Renata that night, the friend who had found my book. She was at my place in 40 minutes with a bag over her shoulder and a look on her face like she was walking into a war room. She sat across from me and said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning and do not leave anything out." So I did. I told her my writing had become real. I told her that corrections did not work unless they continued the story the right way, that vague words got punished, that the story found every gap and pushed through like water through a crack in a wall. Renata listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "How many other people are stuck in your stories right now?" I said at least 3 confirmed. She said, "So Kay isn't even your only problem. She's just the one who found you first." Before I could answer, my phone rang. A name I had not seen in months. Bryant. I had known him from a writing group I used to go to. A decent guy who wrote science fiction. I picked up. His voice was wrong immediately. Too calm. Too even. Like someone reading from a card. He said, "Weird question. Did you write a story about a guy whose phone rings every night at 3 in the morning and the voice on the other end is his own?" My whole body went cold. I wrote that story 11 months ago. In it, the calls start small and build, and on the final call, the voice and the man merge, and he can never hang up again. Bryant said he had been getting those calls for 2 weeks. That the night before, the voice told him he would find a crack in his bathroom mirror in a straight line, and in the morning, it was there. He said, "I think you did this to me." I told him I was working on it. He said, "Fix it fast," and hung up. Renata had heard everything through the phone. She reached across the table and grabbed my arm. "One at a time. Kay first. Her story ends tomorrow. Bryant's doesn't peak for another week. He has time. Kay does not. So sit down and write." I sat down and went slow. The first draft said the notes would simply stop, and Renata caught the gap in 30 seconds. "You haven't said what happens to the other version," she said. "The future Kay, the one doing the writing. Where does she go? You can't ignore her because she's not convenient. The story will find that hole." I tore the page out and started over. The second draft was better. I wrote that the future version of Kay reaches a moment where she looks at the woman she has been writing to and realizes the loop is complete. The present Kay has become strong enough to live without the warnings. She does not need the notes anymore. And so the future Kay chooses to stop. Not because she is forced, because the woman she was trying to protect does not need protecting anymore. Renata read it slowly and then said, "Closer. But what about the old notes? The ones already in the shoebox?" In this version, the future Kay stops writing new ones. Fine, but the old ones are still physical, still sitting in a box. Someone picks that box up a year from now and reads them in order, and the story starts again. You need to account for the artifacts or you've left a way back in. Another gap I had not seen. I started a third draft. Renata left at 2 in the morning and I wrote until my hand cramped and then switched and wrote with the other one. 6 drafts. By dawn, I had a version we both agreed was close, and I knew close was the word that almost killed me during the knocking. I drove to Kay's apartment that evening with the pages on the passenger seat. Renata had beaten me there. She gave me a look that said I had better have something good. Kay was sitting at the table with every note laid out in a row, left to right, first to last, like a timeline of her own unraveling. The early notes on the left were written in neat, steady script. As my eyes moved right, they got darker, the handwriting tighter, more pressed into the paper. The last one, the one that said "tonight," was written in letters that barely looked human. Kay did not greet me. She said, "How many people are you going to ruin before you stop?" I told her I did not know. I told her when I wrote those stories I had no idea what my words could do. It sounded weak even as I said it. She said, "That's worse. You didn't even care enough to check." I stood there and took it because she was right. I reached into my bag and pulled out the pages. I held them in front of me and started reading. Out loud, I went slow. Every word got its full weight. The room went quiet in a way that felt physical, like the air itself was listening. Kay closed her eyes and sat with her hands in her lap. Renata stood behind her with her arms crossed, tracking every sentence. When I finished the last line, Kay opened her eyes and said, "It's good, but you left out one thing." My throat went tight. She leaned forward. "You wrote that the future version of me chooses to stop. Fine. But you never wrote what she chooses instead. A character with no action doesn't just freeze. She wanders. And a wandering character in a real story is a loose thread." I saw it the second she said it. I pulled out a chair, sat at the table next to the row of notes, and turned to the last page of my draft. I wrote 3 new sentences. I wrote that the future version of Kay sits down one final time and picks up her pen and writes one last message. Not a warning, not a threat or a countdown. A thank you to the woman she used to be for being strong enough to survive everything the notes put her through. And then she puts down the pen and stands up and walks out of the story. Not into darkness, not into nothing. morning. Into a morning she has never seen before. One that belongs only to her. Her own morning. A day that was never planned or plotted or written by anyone. I slid the pages to Kay. She read the 3 new sentences slowly, lips moving slightly with each word. The anger was still there underneath, carved into her by 5 months of fear, but something else came through as she read. She set the pages down and said, "That's the ending I would have written for myself." Renata nodded once. We agreed I would read the full version at 11:50, 10 minutes before midnight. Enough time for the words to settle before the original ending tried to trigger. So we waited. Kay made coffee with shaking hands, and Renata sat beside her, and they talked quietly about ordinary things. I read the pages over and over in my head, checking every word. At 11:40, Kay's hand moved. Her right hand shot out sideways and grabbed a pen at the table edge and wrapped around it too tight, and her hand started moving across the nearest piece of paper before anyone could react. Her eyes went wide, not like someone choosing to write, like someone watching their own hand do something they did not instruct. The words appeared in that same sharp, wrong script from the last note. "He cannot save you. The door is already open." Renata moved first. She grabbed Kay's wrist and pulled the pen away and threw it across the room so hard it hit the far wall. Kay was shaking. She looked at me and said, "It's already starting. Read it now." I picked up my pages. My hands were not steady. I gripped tighter and took one breath and started reading. My voice held even when my hands would not. I turned the page and kept going, speaking each word clearly, giving each sentence its full weight. I could feel the room pushing back against me as I read, some pressure in the air that had not been there before, like the story itself was aware of what I was doing and was deciding what it thought about it. The lights flickered and stayed dim for 2 full seconds before coming back. Kay's hand twitched toward where the pen had been, but Renata's grip on her shoulders tightened and the hand fell back to the table. I turned to the second to last section, the part where the future Kay sets the pen on the table and folds her hands and chooses to stop. As those words came out of my mouth, every note on the table lifted, maybe half an inch, like a breeze had caught them all at once, except the windows were closed and the air was still. They rose together, trembled for 1 second like they were being held by something invisible, and settled back down. Kay gasped. Her right hand curled toward the table, fingers reaching, but there was no pen left. Her hand hovered there trembling, and then she pulled it back and pressed it flat against her leg. I kept reading. I did not look at the clock. I knew that if I looked away from the page, I would lose my place and the gap would open. I kept my eyes on the paper and my voice moving through the section where the future Kay understands the loop is done and the woman she has been writing to does not need the warnings anymore. Then I turned to the final page, the 3 sentences about the morning. I read the first sentence and something started happening to the notes on the table. They were fading, not burning, not vanishing, fading. The ink on the nearest one, the one that said, "You left the window open," began to lighten from black to gray. The handwriting itself blurred, as if someone was smudging it with a thumb, except no one was touching it. The paper softened, the edges losing their sharpness, the creases smoothing out. I watched it spreading, note after note, left to right down the line Kay had laid out, each one fading and going clean. Kay was staring at the table with tears running down her face, steady and quiet, not sobbing, just crying the way people cry when something they have been carrying for a very long time finally gets set down. I read the last 3 sentences. My voice cracked on the final word. I felt it break in my throat and for a horrible second thought the crack in my voice would count as a crack in the story, but I pushed through it. The word came out whole, then silence, the kind with weight. The clock ticked through midnight. No new note appeared. Kay's hand stayed still and flat. The shoebox at the end of the table was full of blank pages now, white and clean and smooth, like fresh paper straight from a pack. Every note that had been in that box was gone. Not the paper itself. The paper was still there, but the words were gone. The ink was gone. The handwriting was gone. Kay looked at me, face wet, eyes clear, and said very quietly, "I remember my name." I exhaled in a long, shaking rush. The continuation had worked. The future Kay had walked out of the story into her own morning, and the present Kay had stayed. She was still herself. Renata pulled Kay into a hug, and they held on tight while I stood there holding my pages, feeling something I had not felt in weeks. Then my phone buzzed. Bryant. I answered, and his voice came through with that same flat, wrong evenness. "It happened again tonight," he said. The call came at 3, but this time the voice described what you just did. The notes fading, the reading, word for word. And then it said, "He doesn't have enough words left in him." The line went quiet. The voice on Bryant's phone was not just predicting anymore. It was watching. It knew what I had done tonight, and it was telling me through Bryant that I was going to fail. I lowered the phone. I had saved 1 person. 1. There were at least 3 more whose lives were still moving toward endings I had written, and 11 others I had not even confirmed yet. Bryant was next, and his story was worse than Kay's. In that story, the calls do not just predict things. On the final call, the voice and the man merge. He can never hang up again. I had days to fix that, not hours, but the clock was already running, and every day I waited was a day Bryant got 1 step closer to picking up the phone and never putting it down. Kay looked at the pen in my hand and said, "You're going to do this for all of them, aren't you?" It was not really a question. I sat down, opened my notebook to a blank page, and wrote Bryant's name at the top.